to the channel. I just figured we could do a little sewing vocabulary. So if you, just to familiarize yourself with stitches and sewing terms, and we have it listed on the Facebook page, but let's look at it and see what it really looks like, okay? I'm gonna try to put them in alphabetical order. All right, so we've all heard about a basting stitch. A basting stitch is, I don't know if this is backwards or not, but I'll take pictures of them also and lay them out. A basting stitch is a wide stitch on your machine. Your machine defaults to maybe 2.5 or 3. Put it on your widest stitch. If you have an electronic machine, just dial it up as far as it'll go. Or if you have a machine that has a basting stitch setting, you hit that stitch. Basically, it's a very wide stitch that's temporary or removable. And if you can tell, my machine goes up to 7. So it's a really wide stitch. So if I wanted to pull this stitch out, it's very easy to do. Or you see there's a hand stitch right there. So I just take a needle and hand stitch it together. You do that, you use a basting stitch when you want to just put it together to try it on, put it together temporarily to see what it looks like, put it together, make sure it fits in the space. There's numerous reasons to use a basting stitch. Just think about it as a temporary stitch that you can take out easily, okay? All right, the next one is a binding for the edge. Okay, so you've seen this binding tape. It comes in a package in the store. Sometimes you make them yourself, and you can put it on the edges. So here's a raw edge. So I would take my binding tape and I would stitch it down on the side, and it gives you a nice edge. I've used binding tape for inside seams where maybe it's an unlined garment. And I would use binding to make it really pretty, because binding comes in all different fabrics. You can even make them yourself. So this is a 1/2 inch binding, meaning after it's folded, it's double folded. You'll see that on the package, but you'll see this term. It's double folded to make a 1/2 inch binding. So you'll see double folded 1/2 inch. Okay, so there's binding. Okay, here is a dart. And if you make clothes, women's tops or jackets, you've seen darts. A dart looks like this. It's a triangle shape, and you put those two lines together and you stitch all the way down. A dart is used to create curvature, okay? Particularly on the sides of a top. Let's look at it in this way. Here's a little half scale top, okay? And the dart creates a curve where the chest is, okay? All right, so you can see how it's made on the side. And I'll have a more detailed video of how to actually sew a dart, but that's what a dart is. And then we'll go into a facing, okay? So you make a top, and there's a raw edge. Maybe there's not a collar or anything. A facing is a separate piece. It's typically a pattern piece that mirrors the neck edge. And I'll show you how it's done. The piece mirrors the neck edge, and you stitch it across the neck edge. And because this is a curve, you want to clip the curve so it relaxes that fabric in the curve, and flip the facing over, and you have a bound neck edge. You can use this on neck edges, armholes for a sleeveless top. Facings can be used in the back where a button may go, but there's different, you'll see facings in all areas of garment sewing. Okay, so we have gathers. All right, gathers are made, I'm gonna open this up a little bit. Okay, gathers are made with 2 rows of wide stitched threads, okay? So back to a basting stitch, all right? Gathering thread is a temporary stitch because you're gonna gather it up, then stitch it Maybe it's a skirt. Maybe it's the bottom of a bodice. Maybe it's a neck edge. Gathers are used for a lot of different reasons. So what you're going to do is take your basting stitch and do 2 rows across. Leave your thread tail. Okay, if you can see that, leave your thread tail. And what you're going to do is pull the fabric across the thread. Be careful to keep the thread taut, so you can just slide the fabric across, and that's how you get gathers. Okay, and then you're going to attach it to whatever other pattern piece you're going to have and stitch across. And once you get it all set and you're satisfied that your gathers were done nicely and your other pieces attached nicely, then again, because these gathering threads were made with basting stitches, really wide temporary stitches, you can pull them right out. Gathers. Okay. Let's go to pleats, since they're kind of the same. Pleats are the same. Okay. This particular way, like if you're making a garment and you're working with a pattern, it'll give you pleat lines. It'll say, place this line on top of this line. So basically you're folding the fabric over on itself all along, okay? And you're gonna make them really even, just depending on what it is. Maybe you're doing a skirt, maybe you're pleating a cuff. And then what you wanna do is stitch it across to keep it in place. This is where your iron comes in place, and you're gonna press, and you'll keep them really even and stitch it in place. This stitch may not be temporary. This stitch will probably be permanent. That's why you want to stitch really close to the edge. So if you do attach another pattern piece onto it, maybe the top, the bodice, where this is the bottom of the dress, and you're going to attach, that stitch will just stay underneath there to give your pleats some stability. Okay, those are pleats. Here is a hem. Hems are done so many different ways, okay? This one, all I did was I took the bottom edge of the fabric, I folded it over once, maybe a 1/4 inch, and then I folded it up totally so it's got a nice, neat edge, okay? Then I stitched it across. So there's a hem, and if you use the matching thread, you will rarely see it. So pants, skirts, the bottom of a dress. If you have a specific foot on your machine that will give you a nice hem, like a rolled hem foot, that's nice to use also. It's also very nice and comforting to hand stitch a hem down, which I love to do on beautiful dresses. So there's a hem. Okay. Let's go here. Quilting. You guys have seen this. I know the quilters know what this is, but it is a term that we want to review. So this is 2 pieces of fabric. There's batting on the inside. It's like a foam. I just put a foam in there for this example. And then you're going to draw your lines on the bias across, or whatever design you want, and stitch down. So there's that. And that's 1 piece. And it's very soft and cushy. So that's quilting. Okay. Seam allowance. Seam allowance is simply the amount of fabric that's to the right of your seam. Here's your seam. This is the seam allowance. You see seam allowance on pattern instructions that say 5/8 seam allowance, 3/8 seam allowance. So you want to use the measurements on your throat plate of your machine to determine the seam allowance. When you're working with patterns, patterns are designed with the seam allowance included. So you want to make sure, if you want the right fit, to follow the accurate seam allowance on that the instructions call for. But that's what that is. Seam allowance is the measurement of fabric that you leave after your seam, okay? Understitching, okay? I'm using a pocket as an example because it's the best example of understitching. Understitching is, okay, so I stitch the pocket onto the fabric and I turn, or whatever piece it is. I understitch by there's a seam, okay? This is my seam. I folded it down. I pressed it, fold the seam down, and just stitch on top of the seam. Basically, you're folding the seam down and telling it to stay right there because it's gonna give this pocket an opportunity to fold very nicely. The seam's not gonna be in the way, but that stitch helps the fold happen and stay in place, mainly on pockets. You can understitch the facings that we talked about on the neck edge. Any area where you need the fold to really stay and give it some stability, that's what the term understitching is. And when I go through our actual applications of these terms on another video, I'll show you exactly how to do that. Okay, understitching. Okay, finally, let's look at a piece of fabric. Okay, and you'll see a picture of this if these words are backwards. All right, this is a piece of fabric. All right, it's a woven piece of fabric, just the anatomy of the fabric. This is the selvage edge. This is the manufactured edge of the fabric. The fabric was woven or manufactured this direction, okay? This is the grain line, the fabric, the direction that the grain line of the fabric is. When you are working with garments and you lay the pattern pieces down, you're laying the pattern pieces down with their arrow pointing in the same direction, the grain line, parallel with the selvage edge, okay? You see the diagonal line? That's your bias direction on the fabric. It's actually 45 degrees. If you look at your mats that you have on your cutting table, it's actually 45 degrees. There's a line on your mat that shows you what 45 degrees is, and that's your bias direction on your fabric. Okay, and here's your warp direction of your fibers, and here's the weft direction of your fibers. The warp fibers go up and down, the weft fibers go across. That is real apparent on denim. If you take a look at denim, there's the indigo side and then there's the lighter side. So turn it over and you'll see the direction of the fibers. So it's real apparent on denim. So that's the anatomy of the piece of fabric. So I hope that cleared up some of your questions about the some sewing terms. There's a full list of sewing vocabulary attached here, and just continue to look for other videos so you can see actually how to carry out these terms at your sewing machine. Thank you. See you next time.